Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everyone. I've been hearing from different people around the world letting me know that they find the podcast helpful. It helps them understand what they're going through or what their loved one has been going through. And it helps normalize the experience for them because they feel understood or they have a sense of understanding now what they went through and what this is all about. So many people, when they have been through something like this, are treated like they're now supposed to be experts on their experience. And whoever's asking them the questions about their experience expects them to know and to understand the different modes of manipulation, undue influence. But just because you've gone through something doesn't mean you can explain it. It doesn't mean you have the words even yet for yourself to be able to understand it. So there are people who have mentioned that it's been helpful to listen so that they have an understanding about what they went through, why they stayed in a situation that was really unhealthy or dangerous, where they could tell something was wrong much earlier than the point that they left. And I've also heard from some people who participated in my webinars, which are, as you know, available on my website, where they found it particularly helpful to hear about how to tell their story to other people, and even for the parents or the loved ones to be able to talk about it, to talk about the fact that they had a loved one who they were concerned about, who was in a cultic group, and to know how to portray that story and that loved one so that the focus isn't on their loved one being the source of the problem in their lives or being the source of the problem in their own lives, or that they should carry any shame from their experience. It really, it seems, has helped people learn that they can craft the way they tell their story so that the focus is on the right person, meaning the focus is on the person who did this to them and who did this to their loved one, that there isn't something inherently wrong with them or with their loved one. I want to also mention that I heard from two people in places of the world that I hadn't heard about before, even though I've heard of those places, but I didn't know people were listening there. One is someone who has been listening from Malta, and another person who has been listening in an area in the Congo. And it has been fascinating to hear about why and what speaks to people all over the world. So as always, please let us know. I also want to make sure to mention that there is something called Cult Awareness Day that is coming up on November 18th, 2022. So I don't know when you're going to hear this episode. And if you listen to it when it first comes out, then you will know this date has still yet to come. If you hear this episode after this date has passed, know that this is something that we're hoping to make a yearly event. So on November 18th, 44 years ago, over 900 individuals were victims of a mass murder-suicide who were members of the People's Temple cult. This event is most commonly known as the Jonestown Massacre, which has been described as one of the largest mass deaths in American history. We want to be sensitive so as not to exploit those affected by this tragedy. Cult Awareness Day brings awareness to harms that some have experienced in cultic systems. This year's International Cult Awareness Day is a time to reflect on the anniversary of Jonestown for the following goals: to remember the victims of tragedies that have occurred in cults, with a specific focus this year on remembering the victims of Jonestown, and additional tragedies have occurred in the following other groups: Chinese Dragon Buddha, Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, MOVE, M-O-V-E, Synanon, The Children of God, Olusi Okija, Shinrikyo, Beasts of Satan, Faith Temple Church of the Apostolic Faith, Falun Gong, Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Remnant Fellowship Church, Way Down Workshop, Heaven's Gate, Word of Faith Fellowship, the Solar Temple, Beckard Lane Eckankar, Waco, and many more. And to spread awareness of those harmed by cults is another reason that we want to have a day like this, and to be able to inform people of resources that they have out there now that used to not exist for those who have been harmed while in these settings. We want to honor the lives that have been taken. Jonestown survivor John Cobb has created a memorial site, and with assistance from the San Francisco Historical Society has provided photographs that show the faces of the massacre victims. The victims ranged from children to seniors, and the vast majority of them were African American. As stated on the memorial site, family members and friends of victims will be gathered at the annual Jonestown Memorial Gathering, which will be held at the Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, at 2 p.m. on Friday, November 18th, 2022. The memorial will also be live-streamed on the Jonestown Memorial Facebook site. It is something that has certainly stayed with so many of us in this field and those in the general public. It's important to note that the Jonestown Massacre was on the extreme end of the continuum of harm that can occur in cults, and such extremes are in the minority. But what we learned is that they're possible. So please see if you can be involved in any way that you want, and if you want to watch the live stream, if you want to be involved this year, if you live in that area, or next year. It's a way to really honor those who were entangled and really actually ensnared in a web set by their cult leader. Now, for today, I am very excited to have Syran Warner on the show. He is a journalist and editor from Minneapolis who specializes in stories about cults and coercive control. Best known for breaking a story about a cult that originated in Alaska called The Body, Warner tries his best to be a Swiss Army knife, he says, of a reporter in several formats. His original reporting has been featured in publications such as Newsweek, and he's the editor of thebodyinternational.com, where most of his work can be found. Here's Syran now. I am very happy to have Syran Warner with me today on the show. It is so nice to meet people who care about this issue and who have found a way also to educate people, to uncover information, and who care about it for a lot of the reasons that I do, and probably some of your own. And I'm really excited to get to know you and to get to know your interest and your history. I know you've put a lot of information out there, and you've devoted a lot of time and effort to educating people. So I would love for people to get to know you, who are listeners of this show, and tell us a little bit about you and what you do and what brought you to this.
I was an alt weekly reporter for a long time. Like, I worked as a writer for an alt weekly, and I had a story that was a crime story, basically, that in a world that I typically didn't enter. I was mostly like a culture reporter, but I worked on a crime story, and I ran into a cult. I met a woman who was in a cult, and this was like a 3-year project or something. And I got a bunch of tapes of interviews and stuff from people in this universe. And that eventually turned into what I work on now. I wasn't interested in cults at all before this. It was just like a crazy story kind of landed on my desk. And, then, I started interviewing like cult experts and people who would know, and I just found this stuff like particularly fascinating, and I could see elements of it like that I had experienced in my own personal journey through life. So it's a really long story, but that's where I started from. And these days I'm primarily focused on this cult that I found in Alaska called The Body.
Yes, I most definitely want to talk to you about that. And I'm curious to go back to what you were just saying about how you notice some of these elements and they're sort of tied into your earlier years. What were some of the links that you were noticing with your history?
I mean, one thing that really kind of broke through from me was I talked to a psychologist locally in Minneapolis, where I live, about she used to work on a project called Free Mind. She had been in a cult. She was a therapist, and she, sort of walked me through like, abusive relationships and taught like, this is the kind of stuff that you see in these relationships. Or something like battered woman syndrome is like a really great analog for like what happens in a cult. And like it's sort of like my understanding of what was going on in this universe like came back to like, I mean, I could think of like relationships that I'd been in where, somebody was manipulating me, or like, times where like I was behaving in ways that were bad in the context of like a relationship or something like that I didn't see, that I never would have recognized. But once I started looking up the traits of like toxic relationships and stuff and seeing how they related to something like a cult or a cult leader, it was just like super eye-opening. And also like when I've been talking to this cult, there was this woman that was sort of my gateway to it. And the first time we ever talked, like listening to that tape after, years down the line, and I've talked to cult experts and stuff, and hearing her say like, I've got all this information for you. Like, if I decide I can trust you, I will give you this information. And it's just like this, like, I'm just like, oh, wow. Like I kind of see what was going on there now.
Wow. It's so interesting. And it's interesting that you talk also about seeing how you were engaged in certain behaviors that you started questioning. I mean, people will ask me, if I think that cults will be around, like that somehow they're trending, but they've always been around, I think, and I think they will always be around because of that, because that there are people who at different times are prone to different behaviors just by virtue of being a human being, not realizing at times, not with intentionality, not realizing what they're doing. And sometimes people are realizing what they're doing and they're doing it anyway, but that there are people who are also going to be vulnerable to that. And it's just sort of built into the structure of how we are in terms of our societal interchanges. And so I think, this will always be a timely issue. And so I'm wondering then about this particular group that you're mentioning, and then I want to hear about lots of other things, but let's dive in there. So tell me about this group in Alaska.
So yeah, it was basically like an at-home Bible church, this called The Body, and it's had multiple different names. They changed names when they get into trouble or whatever. But it was a very like, it was started as like a very, very small group. There was this deacon from Texas who came up and like sort of, I guess he was from Washington, but he had been a deacon in Texas. He came up to Alaska, sort of took control over it, and he slowly became like Jesus. Like, he called himself an apostle. And at a certain point, this guy, Mark, who runs the group, he was like writing scripture and stuff, and according to like the lore, he went to hell and fought Satan and took back all that was defiled, which was like having an affair or murder or any sort of like, I mean, it's complicated, but there was this crazy situation in 2014 where a bunch of people got kicked out of the group because they didn't want to play by his rules. And this is like, these are family groups. So there's all these divorces and custody cases. And they just ended up making all of these court records where sort of the cult was on trial, because one person was saying, my husband is a pedophile. And one person was saying, my wife's in a cult. And that's how they sort of like came to be known. I kind of knew that story from like previous work. And then when I checked back in on them, it was like, oh, they were in Hawaii, and now they're in Washington. They're in Washington. They had a sect in Australia. I don't know if that sect is still at all functioning, but that's kind of the brief like history of these people.
Okay, so much to unpack already. First of all, a lot of the places that you mentioned where this group exists, there are a lot of cult groups in these places. And in Australia, there is, and I'm in touch with a lot of people in Australia where there are a lot of cults that are able to feel very protected and hidden there. And also New Zealand. It's a problem.
Like if you go to these places, like if you go to Nikiski, Alaska, like where this cult started, you can kind of see like if you were going to start a cult and you didn't want people in your business and you didn't want anybody to know about it, like great place. Like I've been to in Washington where these people are, in Eastern Washington where it's it's militia country. It's just a good environment. Like if you were trying to do something and you don't want people to know about it.
Right, right. I mean, I'd mention a whole bunch of other places, although I don't want to give anyone an idea of where they should start a cult. But there, yeah, there are a lot of these hidden places, and a lot of places where there's kind of lawlessness to a certain degree too, and so they can kind of just police themselves, which is never a good thing with these groups. I'm wondering also about this story of the leader going to hell and battling whatever. I mean, that these are these stories that are told, that are these fantastical stories that are so fascinating to me, because someone from the outside would say that's insane. But there is something that draws you in when someone tells a story this way, when you're already open to someone having some sort of supernatural powers, or someone being someone who you see as a protector of you. But that sometimes the more outlandish the story, the more believable it is, in this very weird way where people think, well, I mean, that is so out there. Who would have made that up? Right? Isn't that interesting that it gives this, talking about this confirmation bias, for some people, it provides proof, even though from the outside, it just seems really out there and extreme.
The thing is, like, I think if you walked into a meeting at the Body and it was your first meeting and Mark sat down and was like, yeah, I fasted for 40 days and fought Satan and beat up Satan, and now we can all sleep with each other. Like, they would have been like, Jesus Christ, this is like something weird is going on here. But these people are like indoctrinated. They know, like, when you went to Marshall Applewhite's first meeting, he wasn't like, well, we're all gonna like drink poison. That wasn't there. Like, it's it's something like it's a process, and like it's just, to me, like, by the time this really fantastical story came up, they believed that he was communicating with God, and that he was maybe going to be in the next chapter of the Bible or something, whatever. Like, it's a process to get there, to be able to tell a story like that.
Right. So there is this thing that I have thought about, people will ask, just like what you're talking about why people will believe that. And you're right. The leader isn't necessarily going to say the things that are the most extreme right from the start. And sometimes also the leader hasn't even formulated those ideas. They sometimes just go on and sort of create ideas and stories as they come up in their own minds. So that's not even codified from the beginning. But I think, there is this dual track, one that's known and one that's not known when people get involved in these things. The known is what you're being taught. The unknown, the invisible track that you're being put on, is the one where you're taught that if you question, there's something wrong with you. If you don't open your heart up to this, the magic won't come to you, whatever it is. So you're getting more and more disarmed and handicapped along the way without realizing it, so that you don't question, or you don't think it's okay to question. And you start to think this person must be telling the truth, or at least you need to believe that he or she is, in order to receive the gifts of this place. Do you think that was part of what was happening here?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, while you were saying that, I was thinking of, these groups, they all kind of have like similar features or whatever. And in this group, like, there's shunning. Like, these people, when these families separated, like, you're not allowed to talk to your ex-husband, or you're not allowed to talk to somebody who got kicked. Like, you can't talk to it. And what Mark was using in this situation was, he was saying like, oh, that person has a demon. Like, they have a demon, and like, if you make eye contact with them, like if they touch you, like, you're gonna have a demon. And it sounds like silly. Once you get too far in, like, you're just kind of like you're in. And if you believe one thing, this one fantastic belief, they can kind of pile up but you see these things, these traits. I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
It really is. I mean, right, exactly. If someone said, don't look at that person because they have a demon, and you just happen to come across this person on the street, you would say, okay, keep walking. But there is this sense, first of all, that you're already in this mode of wondering if this person is right. And I think a lot of people who I work with say they were in this sort of what if mode. What if this is true? I can't take the risk.
Well, I mean, the risk is like that I mean, this is like the one true way of God. This is like a privilege to get to be there. Like, you don't want, like, the people who were like exiled from this place, like none of them wanted to go, because they had access to what they believed was like, the one, like the truest version of God, the purest version of God. And the afterlife and whatever they all thought. But I mean, that's definitely, these aren't like crazy people. There's nothing like crazy about them. Some of these people were like school teachers that were in this group. From the outside, you never would have known that one of these teachers believed in demons or whatever. Like, you wouldn't see that. And I know some of these people who've come out of it, talking to survivors who, they're intelligent. They're not like pushovers or something like that either.
Right. They're not gullible. They're not. I mean, I think that what is so interesting, and part of the reason that I do this show, is to be able to show that this is part of the human condition, that we are vulnerable and some things are going to speak to us. I mean, from my tradition, if someone were to present something within sort of a Christian realm, that might not speak to me being Jewish. But there could be a Jewish cult that, could get me involved. I mean, probably not at this point, but still. But I do think that there are a lot of people who are feeling a lot of shame about what they went through because they feel they're going to be judged. And they oftentimes are, which is truly unfair, because really the focus should be on the person who is doing this to them, the leader. And I'm wondering then what your assessment is as you came to kind of study him. What is his deal?
What is Mark's deal? I mean, I guess from talking to like Alexandra Stein is like she's brilliant lady who, she has a PhD in social psychology, and sort of we've talked a few times just about, the subject. And what I see from this guy is that, he's a psychopath. Like, I think there's sort of like a myth in society that there's like some good in everybody. Like, we tell kids, like everybody's good and pure, and sometimes they get messed up, whatever. And it's like, but also like sometimes a cult leader, like not all of them were like abused as like children or whatever. I mean, I don't know this guy's particular like early childhood history or whatever, but some people just want to control people. Like, you or I maybe know, like if I wanted to control somebody into doing whatever, it might be something that I could pull off because I know I sort of know the mechanisms or whatever. But I don't have any interest in that because like I don't want to control people. Like, and I couldn't be married to someone who like loved me only because I was like controlling them. Like, part of what makes life beautiful is like that people have their own choices and everything. But it's also, it's human history is like people trying to control people, and the people who have the power and the people who don't. It's like the whole story of like humanity. With Mark, like I mean, I don't know why he does everything he does. He's extremely paranoid. Like, I think he had like that's a part of like what makes him behave the way he does and make the decisions that he makes, is that he's just like he is scared, in a way too. Like, but he doesn't mind if he destroys people's lives. Like, it doesn't matter to him.
It's an incredible thing. right? I mean, that there are people who are walking among us who just don't have that level of conscience. And when you come across them, I find it really chilling, actually. I find it's like Silence of the Lambs moment where you go, ah, ha, 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 ha. You just get this sense that here, this is someone who will stop at nothing, who isn't guided by the same internal locus of control that would stop you from doing something, would stop me from doing something. Their focus is completely on something else. And if people are harmed along the way, that's just kind of incidental and it happens. And to be so detached in that way, I think is the chilling part to me. And that's where a lot of damage can happen. What do you think he's paranoid about?
He thinks like the FBI is after him. And I mean, I don't know. It's like what is real and what is like a fantasy, or what does he want people to think too? Like maybe part of his paranoid, like what I hear about him that's paranoid, like he wants other people to have that fear. Like most people have met a Mark Bissett before, even if it wasn't a cult situation, they weren't in a cult, but you had some boss that would like do like it didn't matter what, like just behave like completely unethically for whatever gain they were going to get. And it's like, man, like you run into people, it doesn't maybe get as extreme as somebody like Mark, or like, any sort of cult leader, like anybody who like is like actively trying to control people for their own gain. Like in small ways, like you can see this stuff like in your workplace, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you don't have to go to a cult group. You don't have to go to a religious group to see it. You just don't, because it is around us. It's an interesting thing, too. There have been some studies about sociopathy. And as you get higher up the food chain in Fortune 500 companies, the level of sociopathy increases. And, it's all about bottom line and not who you hurt along the way or what waterway you poison along the way in order to make your product. And so I think it's really interesting to also, when you were talking about how people left en masse at one point when things shifted, which happens, suddenly the rules change and there's some people who cannot abide by that. And there are other people who stay. I'm always fascinated by the people who stay and why they stay. But I'm curious about that pivotal moment. If you can talk about that, what was happening then that made people leave?
Well, the sort of, I mean, a lot of it has to do with sex, I will say, and wanting some people out. I mean, the two of the people that left were the wives of, the guy in charge and his sort of number two. And they, like, astonishingly, they wound up with like much younger women.
Yeah, I'm shocked.
Yeah, there were people who just like who might have been bad for business that left. And there were, I mean, what makes it so extreme when you look back on that like those days is that like there's a woman, she's kind of been like the focus of my work, a lot of the work that I do, is that she left, she abandoned like 6 children to like stay in this group. Like there was a custody case. She had a 2-year-old daughter that she left behind, hasn't seen in 7 years. And she was like a great mom in a good family before this happened to her. And now she's still hasn't seen any of her kids, or kids have tried to reach out to her. Like she is just like, and this just like isn't what she would have wanted. But that's maybe like, I guess, I mean, it's a really complicated story of like the Exodus in 2014 and 2015, but it's like still like relevant today because like, people like this woman hasn't seen her kids. One of the woman who's now married to the cult leader, she hasn't seen her kids in 7 years or, talk to them. Like, a lot of people just got like separated in family situations. It doesn't just affect like, oh, well, the husband is leaving and the wife is going. Like it's still, you have all these other lives of these kids involved too. And that was the big thing too. Like another exodus, the whole reason why like anybody knows who I am, why anybody would know about me enough for me to be on this show is like, children were rescued and people were arrested earlier this year. it's that sort of separation, the leaving of the people who come and go, like in this group, like what I've basically found is there are some people who are sort of transient, where they'll sort of join and be there for a little while, and they're like, I don't know about this, and they're gone. And but for the people who go all the way in, like they don't come out unless there's extreme circumstances, unless there's a very serious reason for them to not be involved anymore.
It's so interesting. The idea of people being arrested, et cetera. I mean, for some groups that can shut them down. And with others, you find there is this resilience. I don't know what to call it, but a group can still maintain itself even after there are arrests. And they do change names and other sorts of things like you were mentioning before. But when you have a leader who can present themselves as being sort of this martyred figure and unfairly crucified, then there are people who rally to his side or to her side and become even stronger adherers to the ideals, and other people who leave. So there's a lot of upheaval, but there is something actually really empowering for at least the people I've worked with who were raised in groups where they didn't know that there were law enforcement officials in the world who were going to care about what was happening to them there. And having people come in and having people get arrested or being rescued, while it's traumatic in its own way, kind of introduced for a lot of people I've seen over the years, this idea that there is this code of how you are supposed to behave and not behave that exists in the world, and the group is not following it, and people care about that. But I think going back to this idea of these parents who leave even a 2-year-old and how that's possible, it really becomes, it sounds like either the leader or the group becomes this thing standing squarely between you and your children, even emotionally. And I'm wondering about this woman and what you think drove her into this group. What spoke to her? Why did she feel like she should leave her family behind?
Well, I mean, it's circumstances, and it's like, I mean, it's good, and like there's this good and evil component that, like, I guess, like, I don't have, I don't personally, like, I don't know, I was raised Catholic, but that kind of stuff, like some of this stuff never just like stuck to me, the good and evil stuff. But it's like, you know, the guy who has her kids, she thinks like he's, you know, he's got a demon. And I'm sure, like, I mean, she's well aware of me and what I'm trying to do, and that I've been like screaming about getting her out of this thing for years. And, you know, I'm sure, like, you know, she's been told, like, that guy is like, you know, he's got the spirit of Satan or something like that, something that I don't understand. I mean, it's hard, like, especially when you talk to parents, like when I talk to parents about this story, and I'm like, yeah, this happened with like these little kids, you know, they're using paddles on kids who are 3 months old, and they're like, Jesus Christ, like I could never, like I can't even imagine that, like as a parent. But it's like there's more that goes into it. Like, it's, if you believed the sort of cosmic battle between good and evil, it's less insane. But you're right though too, like, because, you know, I hope that sometimes like these consequences kind of like jostle the system, or just like having these, when somebody's arrested, they can't like talk to the cult leader or whatever, and maybe they have a better chance of getting out. I mean, I guess, I mean, like famously, like Stephen Hassan, like was in a van wreck, and being in the hospital, not being able to talk to everybody, having like the only people who could visit were like family. You could, like, no cult members were allowed in there. And then he, you know, became a cult advocate and got out. And a lot of times, like, it's things like that, or just, you know, being like physically separated, not having the influence there. And, you know, I lost like I haven't talked to I miss my dad or something like that.
Right. Yeah. There is something about separating yourself out. And, you know, Steve did have a chance, I mean, for better or for worse, to get in this accident and break something and wind up in the hospital just from, you know, being in the Moonies and being underslept and needing to drive this van. And while he's trying to get donations for an already very wealthy group, being out on the street at night. I think that there is something very powerful when I hear people say they got involved in a group and the thing that helped them was that they got the flu, or that they had to go away, or they had to take some time away. There's something about it kind of breaking a spell at times that is very powerful, but also the people who you have learned to demonize are sometimes the ones who then come back into your life in that moment because you need them. And you realize they're not bad people, and you realize there are people still in the world who love you and care about you. And, there's somewhere to go. You don't have to stay in this group. But the whole good and evil, I mean, the demon, the devil idea, for some people, yeah, that's enough. That's enough for them to like really to keep them there. That's enough for them to cut off their emotions, even that very primal connection to a child. And it is so powerful and so upsetting. I mean, I know this work is not easy when you start uncovering these stories, and some of what you've probably needed to learn to do is take some breaks yourself, because some of these stories are harder than others. And I know there are other stories that you've also investigated that we can go into as well. But have you noticed that sometimes it just gets to be a lot?
No, it is a lot. It is a lot. And I guess I was thinking like something people might relate to is like, have you ever been in a bad relationship with somebody and you go somewhere else and you're hanging out with like people who like treat you well, and they don't like, I don't know. Sometimes like, I guess I've just had relationships before where, you're hanging out with other people who are like in a positive, more positive place. And you're like, hey, wait a minute. Like, I don't know, like Al's kind of mean to me or whatever. Like, he shouldn't talk to me like that or whatever, because these people don't. Like, I see it sort of in my own personal life. I do take somewhat, like, I guess, like, I break up what I do in that I work on different stories, and I also work on, like, other people's stories. And I help other people get, like, documents and stuff. Like, I'm not always in this, like, I do work on, like, cult stuff every day. But there is dark stuff that I don't like. I'm not going to just like marinate myself in that like all the time, because I got to have like split up projects and stuff so that I'm not just like reading about child abuse 24/7 or whatever, because then you like have nightmares.
Right, exactly. But I think what can also happen then is that if you do the work that you do by getting the word out, it can help a lot. When, there's one thing about just being bombarded with information that is so disturbing about things happening and feeling like you're powerless against it. But then when you're able to do something, it does actually help a bit. You think, okay, well, I actually feel like I can prevent, or I can educate, or I can do something, maybe save someone along the way. I'm wondering about some of the other stories, other groups that you were following, R. Kelly, others, that we can talk about, whatever you feel comfortable.
I guess as far as like working on other stories, like there's sometimes I'll learn something. Like there was this cultish situation where there's this cult making a podcast about how cults are bad. And, I was like, I'm writing an article about that. Like, that's like, I'm not going to like leave that alone or whatever. And then, so you get the lead or whatever. Like, I don't like look for stories like I used to, because they all kind of like come to me at this point. I had just a fascinating conversation the other day with somebody. Somebody wanted to talk to me because they were in a group that was a lot like The Body. And I wasn't going to write a story about this woman's experience or anything, but like she wanted to talk, and I generally try to talk like, the people who reach out or whatever, because like I sort of like if I can be of use in any way. And that was like super, super fun. And I mean, like I say fun and fascinating, like it's a horrifying story, but like it was something where when we were talking, I was like, like, do you know how to look up like these court records or whatever? Like we should talk to some of these other people. And like, look, we ended up like spending a ton of time looking into like court files and stuff, because I know how to pull that stuff, like as a journalist who's been doing this for a while. And it was great. It was like this little like oasis working with this woman on her story from like the constant, like the rest of the stuff I do. There are some things, like I got an email last year about Direct Action Everywhere, which is like this vegan cult. And it was like, I just heard the premise, like, this vegan cult, they pack all these people in houses, and I was just listening to it, and I was like, that is like so fascinating. Like, people don't know, and a lot of people like me, like I live in a liberal bubble sort of, and like left-wing cults, like when I heard, I guess like Alexandra Stein, she was in this communist left-wing cult, and I didn't know that like there could possibly be such thing as a left-wing cult, and that story kind of coming to me was like, I gotta tell that story. And I guess like R. Kelly, that I did interview R. Kelly a while ago. And that's something that like was sort of like random. Like he was about to go down in flames. Everybody knew it. Didn't know about the cult stuff. He wasn't being called a cult leader at the time. This is late 2016, I believe. And somebody at the newspaper I worked at was like, "You want to interview R. Kelly?" And I was like, "Hell yeah, I want to interview R. Kelly. Like, are you kidding me?" And, he had like a manager on the phone and everything. Like, it wasn't like I didn't get to ask him the questions you would want, but I presented that interview like in a way, and I've recycled it now. Like on my website, there's a link to this video that's about where it's Alexandra Stein and another psychologist, I think I actually mentioned her earlier, talking about like abusive relationships in relation to cults. And like I spliced that together with like my interview with R. Kelly, because I think people might understand that it's sort of a vehicle. So I mean, I don't know. I'm also just like a lucky. I don't know. I'm always amazed what the kind of stories that wind up on my desk, the kind of stuff where I see and I go like, this has got to be a story, or I'm gonna like hire somebody to write a story about this or whatever. Because I mean, these groups are just like it's like I care deeply about like what's going on, and I think that the more people know about this, the less likely they'll ever be susceptible to this. Like if there was some class or in middle school or something where they told you about toxic relationships, they told you about abusive relationships, and they told you about cults, like less people would join cults, less people would find themselves in toxic relationships. But I guess like I find, but there's elements to some of these stories where you just go like, are you like, you hear, like I was working on this for a little while before I heard about Mark fighting Satan, like the cult leader fighting Satan. And it's just like, as like a storyteller, like I just like a good story. And that's something that's fascinating. I mean, a cult starting a podcast, telling people like disinformation about cults, like that's just like, it's a good story, like beyond, like alert, like sounding the alarm. And I've talked to other journalists too who've worked on like cult stories, and it's just one of these things, like you just will hear details sometimes, or you'll read something in a police report and you'll be like, that happened in real life, like that really happened.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. I actually just happened to be at a party a couple of weeks ago and sat down next to this guy who's turns out to be a psychiatrist. He did pro bono work in the early years for cult victims. I mean, we just happened to be chatting. And so he was there at the time that I was there, when we were both affiliated with the Cult Awareness Network, when it was shut down and taken over by Scientology. And so that whole idea that this organization that was started by concerned parents who didn't know what was happening to their children, and really was started around a kitchen table in a very organic mom and pop way, then became what felt very threatening to Scientology. And they certainly acted that way. They came to all the conferences and shouted in our faces and wrote down our license plate numbers and we'd get in our faces, take pictures of us and whatever, do a lot of very harassing things. But then they sued the Cult Awareness Network so many times that they had to file for bankruptcy. Then the name became public. They took over the name.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable story.
Right. So when you call, same thing with this podcast about cults that's run by a cult. So if you're calling the Cult Awareness Network, you're talking to a Scientologist. One of the things that is so interesting about that is exactly as you're saying, if people have this education early on about not to take things at face value, to say, okay, there's an organization called the Cult Awareness Network. Let me do my research. Let me find out what it is and who runs it. And let me find out who's going to be answering the phone or who's going to be responding to my emails. But people don't usually ask themselves those questions. They'll read a study and not go and research not only who put it together, but who funded it. And that's when you're going to find out sometimes why the results are the way they are. But we are not educated in this way as we should be. I remember also, going back to R. Kelly for a moment, there are a lot of people who are worried about not being believed. They don't come forward with their stories. And I remember getting a call a couple of years ago from a woman who said her daughter had been taken in by a musician and she was living in his house and she wasn't allowed to leave. And she kept saying, I know you're not going to believe me. I'm not even going to tell you who it is because then you're really not going to believe me. And she just wouldn't ever say the name. I knew who she was talking about. And she was just sure that I was going to discount her right away because here he had star power and name recognition and she was not going to be believed. So a lot of people don't come forward who should, and a lot of people are not believed who should be. I'm wondering just about talking to R. Kelly, what your impression was, even though it was being monitored and you couldn't speak freely.
I mean, I guess my impression was like he was just that he was a narcissist, like a crazy narcissist was obvious, even though we were just in I guess we talked for like a half hour. There was also some moment where like he's like, yeah, everything's going great, like sitting on the tour bus, blah blah, and then a second later he's like, you can just hear him like yelling off the phone, like, hey, yelling at somebody. And then going right back to being like, yeah, everything's great. Here's my new song, where it's like his personality like came through enough to the point where I was shocked though, like when I heard that like he had that interview. He has this famous interview with Gayle King where he kind of goes down in flames. And he's like, a cult? Like, I don't have a cult. I don't even know what a cult is. Like, I know I don't have one. And it's like just hearing, him, like the word cult being associated with this guy. Cause like I've seen R. Kelly in concert before. Like, I knew for a long time, like he was not it was not a model citizen. But until like the real story, until Survivor started talking, nobody really knew like how extreme the situation was. And I mean, you're totally right, because people say this to me like all the time is they'll be telling me a story and like, I know this is going to sound crazy. I know I'm going to sound insane or whatever. And it's like, you know what? Like, if you knew all the stuff I hear, like you would know that like, it's not actually crazy. Like, and people like I hear stories frequently that are like harrowing stories that have, as long as like it's like there's some like basis in, I don't know, like I just have I trust survivors. I mean, I talk to people long enough where if they were full of BS, like it would come through in the rest of their conversation or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think we have similar challenge where we need to be able to decipher what's real from what isn't. For you, in terms of being a journalist, for me, in terms of doing counseling, if someone has a disorder, or if they're really talking about what they came to believe and learn, and this is not a delusion that is sort of built into their system that they would have had anyway. But being able to unpack that, there's so many more people who have stories out there than they share, because they're so worried about being seen as the crazy people in the story. And I really want people to tell their story in a way where they can have the focus be on the person who did this to them, not somehow, what is quote unquote wrong with them. But it's a hard thing with society. There are a lot of people who respond to people who've been involved in things like this by needing to tell them, I would never fall for this and I would never get involved. Like they need to posture in this way. I don't know what that is. about. But it also shuts people down from being able to really be open and talking.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like that's part of like why education is so important too, because like people just assume this could never happen to them. Like nobody thinks like I'm cult material, like I'm vulnerable or whatever. Like if people sort of like knew about this stuff and knew like it could happen, this stuff could happen to anybody. Like, your beliefs and like what you want to believe is true. And like, I mean, it's a whole system, I guess. But I mean, I see it a lot too in like I'm not going to like step into politics or anything, but I'm going to say like, you can see like what people believe and like want to believe or whatever in people's politics a lot of the times. Like some politician will do something bad and people will say like, oh, like it wasn't like they'll just like it didn't happen. Like it'll just be like excuse like terrible behavior. And this happens in cults all the time where, the cult leader will get exposed and it's like, well, the media is lying or whatever is going on. And this is not true because this guy is the greatest or whatever, or this gal.
There are people in this world who do so much on a daily basis that is so off and wrong that I think people just start to expect it. And that I think they don't hold them up to a standard because they just can't keep up, and they would just constantly be putting out fires. So I think then people focus their attention on the details of the person who they're needing to be perfect and they're expecting to be perfect. And then they get them on that. I sort of see this within family systems, right? The kid who sneaks out of the house every night and, has a lot of issues and school issues and friendship issues or drug issues, whatever else. Parents will sometimes sort of be like, okay, as long as they're not burning the house down, then we'll just let them be. And the other kid who might have gotten a B on a test, they're going to be the ones getting a talking to. And they're thinking, what? Why am I under this microscope and the other person isn't? And that it's just really not right. But it does give people a pass who are just so out of control. And because I think that we just can't keep up with all the fires that they set day in and day out. I'm wondering too, going back to R. Kelly for a moment, there's something similar that I saw within his group that happens in cultic groups that also happens in politics, I think, to bring this full circle to what you brought up, that there is this person in charge, and then there is this circle around them of the people who keep their secrets and the people who keep people at bay and the people who protect them, and also the people who are going to be the ones taking the fall for them a lot of the time, like the ones then getting arrested or the ones who are charged with things, and they protect the person in the middle. And it seemed like there were a lot of people within R. Kelly circle who knew about what was happening, but kept things secret and were the ones who were initially interviewed or charged with things. But the same thing happens within a governmental system. Have you seen that?
I mean, I guess like with like cultic groups or, what R. Kelly was doing, another way to look at it, like you don't even have to use the word cult, like it's like organized crime, like, or, and you see this in politics too, where it's like, it's an organized system where like the people at the top, like there's some benefit to being R. Kelly's, like the person who's driving these women around and like doesn't, maybe he's not brainwashed by R. Kelly, but it's like, now it's like organized crime. I mean, I guess I see that stuff like frequently. That you look at people's associates or whatever, and oftentimes, these people will line themselves with other people who are doing bad stuff or who are just willing to turn a blind eye or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's really true. It's really true. I'm wondering. Also, going back to your mention of a particular podcast. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I really want people to be informed about the kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing part of this business. And so what did you find out about this other podcast that you were looking into?
So there's this podcast that is called Cultish. I'll say the name of the podcast. And it's a church called like Apologia Church that funds this podcast, like 100%. Like you can look at that's not a secret. And they say that they talk about cults like, I mean, it's one of these cult stories that's just so bonkers. Like, I mean, I guess like we were just talking about like how some people are like, you're not gonna people feel like they won't be believed when they leave a cult story. Like when I wrote about this cult podcast that was actually run by a cult, or that, it's supposedly ostensibly trying to like warn people about cults, but is really like run by this like, abusive church. It sounded so crazy that I used hyperlink after hyperlink after hyperlink in my article, because I was like, no, really, like this, like, if you're curious about this, you can click on a button and it will take you to checkmychurch.com or whatever, which has, other resources about this group. Because like it just sounds insane. They sent their members after me too. It's really, I've been smeared a few times, like, because cults like to smear, and I write stories about cults. But yeah, they like sent all these people after me, and it was just a big, and then they all like disappeared. Like it was like something happened, and I think they got a little too close to the sun messing with me, because I was continuing to release information about them, and all of a sudden, like nobody from the 100 people that they sent to me, like all of a sudden they all lost interest in coming after me. I guess that was my experience. That's what and that's just like what kind of organization this is.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've thought about that for myself, and I started naming the names of the PIs sent after me by Scientology and others, and what they're up to, and the sites online about me and the things they've said. And I'm just kind of taking the power back by saying, yep, this is who they are. This is what they're saying. This is what they're doing.
Yeah, it's important for people to know that. Like, it's important, like if you're putting out information, like, because somebody is going to say, like, Rachel is like, she's this horrible person. She's a liar, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Like that could happen if somebody Googles, if they show us like some new member, like a link to some article that some smear on you. Like, that's like, that person might be like, oh, like Rachel is a liar, whatever. But if you sort of like come back and say, like, this is what people are saying about me. Mm-hmm. This is like why they are saying it. Here's like an example of like, here's what's going on, like in this group. Like, here's what we know. Mm-hmm. Here are court records or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Then, you're a little harder to keep smearing, because anybody, like, we live in the information age. And people, I always encourage people, like, I know, like, this is sometimes like sort of dangerous work. And I'm not going to tell people to do something dangerous because they should, or I feel like, more and more stories need to be out there so people are safer. But like this stuff is important, and just like really like, the truth, like using the information that you have, especially like, or like if you made a mistake and you admitted that you made a mistake, like that would be like, really confusing to the people trying to smear you or whatever. You can always like the truth will prevail. Like the thing about cultish is they were like saying stuff about me that wasn't real. The thing about the body, they say stuff about me that's like not real. They're saying I'm working with these people or whatever that I've never talked to in my life. And it's like, yeah, I'm just going to tell the truth, like, because I can do that and you can't. Like, if you told the truth, you'd be screwed.
Right. It's true. Right. Yeah. I think about getting contacted by the editor of Freedom Magazine, the ironically named Scientology online publication. And all about how I lost my license and I'm Leah Remini's therapist and all these things. And I'm like, no, and no, and no. And we want your statement. And I said, no. And it didn't matter. They just published a thing anyway and quoted me as though I had had a conversation with it. Like none of the truth matters about anything. And it should, but it doesn't. So that's why it's always buyer beware. You want to know who puts out the publication, who is funding it. Look at the small print and see who's putting it out there. Anyway, yeah. So
I guess and we deal with this stuff in minor ways, like every single day. Like we live in that's just part of life. I mean, we get advertised to, and it's man, this sandwich looks really good or whatever, and you see it in person, and it's not the same thing. Discerning what is real and what is false. We all do it, and we all probably I know, I guess I'll just speak for myself. I know there are things that I am wrong about, that are beliefs that I have that are they don't reflect the empirical reality of something. Or just I have some memory of this was a really good movie or something, and I'll watch it again and be what was I thinking? That was awful or whatever. This discerning the truth from fact, it gets really extreme. We're talking about cults, or you're talking about what happened with R. Kelly, or what's going on with the body, stuff like that. It gets really extreme, but this is just a function of humanity, and especially in the modern world, especially in the information age. You're talking about this Freedom magazine, and that is hilarious that it's called Freedom magazine or whatever. But writing an article about you using quotes that aren't real or whatever. The problem with that is that not everybody knows. The only person who knows that they stole your quotes is you and whoever wrote the article or whatever. And they just tell people this is what's going on with Rachel, and Scientology actually isn't bad, and of course she's going to say this because she's Leah Remini's therapist, and we've already told you 100 times that Leah Remini is she's getting paid from whatever they say about her. I don't know exactly what they say about her, but I'm sure they got to have a story because she's so public.
Yeah, no, I think they were using her name to get to kind of draw attention to me by saying that she was my client. Not that I'd be able to say if she were my client anyway, but I can honestly say she's not. And so the thing is that it doesn't matter, and they'll just publish whatever they want to publish. And that according to them, I've lost my license a number of times, but whatever and it should matter, but I just keep plugging along. What I think is important is exactly as you're saying, that these stories are out there and there is danger, and it's a dark side, and it's like the mafia. There is this underbelly that we get introduced to that is really unsettling. And at the same time, there's this part that really is about all of us, that we are all open to being manipulated, to having biases, to being controlled in some form or another, and believing things that are just not quite true.
I do want to talk about this because it's something that you did that really affected, was important to me. And my just coming to an understanding of this stuff. There's a story that you told about confirmation bias, and we're talking about what's real and not real, and cult survivors, and what I don't know, the stories that sound impossible but are true or whatever. And I love hearing about this. You tell this story about Heaven's Gate, where they bought do you want to briefly tell that story, the gist of it?
Yeah. So at the time of the Heaven's Gate cult and then the deaths, there had been this Hale-Bopp comet making its way around, and Marshall Applewhite believed that the mothership was accompanying this comet. And so this is where the group was supposed to go to, and to live perfect lives on this mothership. So they went to a telescope shop in San Diego near where their home was, and where they were all living together, and bought the most expensive telescope they could purchase at that shop, and took it back, put it together, and then brought it back to the store a few days later, telling the store owner that it wasn't working. Because it could see the comet clearly, and there was nothing around it. there was just the comet and the tail of it, and nothing around. And then it was that the telescope was broken. And that left such an impression on me. I remember that was in the New Yorker magazine. And and the guy from the telescope shop still talks about it.
That story, like just based on like what I do and working on these stories and stuff, this is just one of those things. Like I heard it from listening to your podcast. You have like a shorter episode, maybe there can be like a link to that or something, because like that story and this idea of confirmation bias and like what you want to believe, what people want to believe, and what you're convinced to believe, is so fascinating to me. And that's the kind of thing that like, as like, I work on these stories, like I'm always like, telling stories, and that is like just a fascinating, like the human element of it. Like, I mean, it's so sad, like knowing what's going to happen next, that these people have this, they're returning this telescope because it doesn't work. And like you just know, man, like, if one of those people would have been like, hey, like maybe there is no spaceship or whatever, like things would have worked out differently. But that's not how like cult stories really tend to operate. And it's fascinating. Like I remember listening, I think I listened to that episode like twice in a row when it came out, because and I'm probably made like my stepmom listen to it or something like that. I share cult stories with her. It says so much about these kinds of groups, and it's also really important to me. Like the Heaven's Gate is fascinating. The more like in a way too, like because people look at what happened in California at the end of the time in Heaven's Gate, and they're like, a lot of people are like, look at these freaks or whatever. Look at these weirdos like getting castrated and blah blah blah. And it's like, no, like if you actually like really knew the story and who these people are. I thought 2020 this year had a special for the 25th anniversary where they actually had like cult experts on and showed footage from these people, and you realize that like what you think is sort of wrong. And this, like, it's almost ordinary to give this telescope back and say it doesn't work. And yeah, I just thought it was a fascinating story. I wanted to like bring up just because I guess you know so much more about this than I do, but I mean the idea of like confirmation bias, like I've had heard the term before, but hearing that story and that setting as like a cult story, it was like, oh, this like now this thing makes sense.
Right. And then when you all are connected in believing something that is different than what other people see, it really binds you to the other people who see it just like you. And then you then share that vision together, and you then rely on the person who is offering you that vision. And you just have to believe at this point and at that stage of the game, especially after castration and other things, that they're just right and they have to be. But yeah, these are people who were sweet people who were trying to find their way in the world and trying to connect, and sometimes feeling like they were having a hard time with that, and like they're gentle souls. And I really had a lot of feeling for them watching the videos that they made before they died. But it's true, I come across a lot of people who are really these kind of sweet seekers, people who are feeling like mainstream society just wasn't for them, or they were having difficulties for one reason or another, and they were trying to find their way, and they were taken advantage of along the way. And I feel like if the cult leader got out of the way, sometimes these groups of people would be really lovely. Like they would have a nice sort of communal way of being and living and treating each other. It's just that the cult leader with their sociopathy is going to make it a really dangerous place.
Yeah. I mean, there's just like, human loneliness. Like, a lot of the stories from Heaven's Gate, people that like there's like an in-group. I mean, there's really heartbreaking like phone calls from like family, but people who called their family members and like calling you for the last time or whatever. I guess they didn't say they were calling for the last time, but they were saying like, I'm not really going to talk to you anymore because like I'm in this group and that's what I do now. That there's like a sense of like belonging, that everybody people like to belong. Like if you're in some sort of group and like nobody likes you or something, you feel like no one likes you, it feels terrible. And this is, yeah, I mean, I think about that, like, just like it's good. It feels good to belong. And that's another reason, like at the very beginning of this, we were talking about how like, were there cults in the past? Yes, there are cults now. And there will probably always be cults. And there will always be people who want to belong and people who take advantage of that, I guess.
Absolutely right. And I think that's also why, going back to something you brought up, but I think that's why ostracizing people, cutting them off is the biggest threat. It's the thing that is going to speak to people. It's going to be the thing that really, I think, does the most behavior modification for them, because they don't want to lose the connection, because it is so much about community and connection and having a sense of being a part of something and not spinning off in space by yourself, not being the only one sitting by yourself. I mean, that's a horrible feeling. And so, yeah, these groups give you this sense that you can now be a part of something unlike anywhere else, and you can have success in that way. Anyway, it is so interesting to talk to you. I know there are so many more things that we could talk about and so many more stories you're going to be working on, and we'll probably have the wish or the need to talk to each other and go over ideas. But it's a pleasure thinking about a community, to meet people within this community who care, who are intrigued by the stories, but also have kind of a heartfelt connection to the people who are affected by it.
It's been great to be on here. And I mean, part of what I think about, like, what your work is so important is that you know how like the brain works. Like this is literally your job, is to like counsel people, and you're licensed because that kind of work is it's to validate like these experiences. Like I've always been a big fan of your show. It was recommended to me, literally, like my shrink was like, you ever listen to IndoctriNation? That's how I came across the show. And yeah, I mean, it's been great to connect with you and have these conversations. And yeah, hopefully we can talk again in the future about whatever happens next.
Right. And there will always be a next. And so, yes, we will have an opportunity to do that. And so thank you. I'm glad you're a fan of the show. I'm glad that you're taking part in wanting to make the world safer, if at all possible, in our little ways, as much as it's a David versus Goliath story, because there are cults being generated every day, new ones, and things growing, and the internet being a place of, well, a lot of people getting involved, but we'll continue doing our part. So anyway, really nice to talk to you, really nice to get to know you, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
One more thing before you go. Thank you so much to Syran for taking the time to speak with us, and also for his work. He is one of these people who is dedicated to saving people, protecting people, informing people about what's happening, righting a wrong, getting justice, getting exposure. And journalists have a lot of power where they can really dig deep and find out information, behind the scenes information usually that a cult or controller wants to keep hidden. And what's also interesting about talking to Syran is that he reminds me of me in so many ways, because neither of us have had a cult experience personally, but it's been close enough to us and has spoken to our hearts, where we have jumped in and dealt with the fact that sometimes there's a lot of pushback and harassment that comes from doing this work, but that there is the real need to protect people and to inform the public and to find out, to uncover, and to make sure that people don't get to continue doing what they're doing just because no one took the time to explore it and expose it. What's also interesting about the timing of the show is with the announcement of Occult Awareness Day. And because it is memorializing and honoring the victims of Jonestown, I think about the fact that Syran is so keyed in, so attached to the story of the body, this cult, and people's experiences within it, and how it really has gotten under his skin and changed him in some ways, in some very powerful ways. And that's what Jonestown did to me. Hearing the stories, finding out that this could happen en masse to over 900 people, and wondering how it could happen, trying to understand. It wasn't until much later that we had a composite of what happened, that people were able to be interviewed from different perspectives, who had been there, some who had escaped beforehand, others who narrowly escaped that day, who could talk about how Jim Jones orchestrated the mass suicide. And it's hard to call it a mass suicide because it really was a mass homicide. But it's something that stayed with a lot of people and also introduced a lot of people to the fact that something can happen like this. And it was terrifying. But it also introduces you to a couple of things. What kind of person would get involved in something like this, and that maybe there's nothing wrong with that person, but that they're searching for community, for belief, for meaning, for purpose. But what is wrong with the leader? The absolute paranoid sociopathy of Jim Jones. And we got this kind of sense about what a leader who is that destructive, that dangerous, what he can do, and to what degree. And when Syran also has gone to explore people's experiences, it sounds like it has really blown him away, really seeing people's pain, but seeing the amount of control that a person can have over someone else, or a person can have over many other people. And not only that, but the strength that it takes to pull yourself away from that, to kind of break the spell, and also to try to get some sort of healing and to try to move on and have any semblance of a normal life after. It is a true testament to the human spirit. And I am moved hearing people's stories just like he is moved hearing people's stories. And so please follow Syran on social media. Follow what he has been able to uncover and expose. It's important, truly important. And I'm sure if you have heard about other groups that you think really need some investigative, journalistic approach, be in contact with him and see if it's something he'd be interested in exploring with you. I really appreciate the work that he does and the work that so many people do to educate and to prevent this from happening to others, if at all possible. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.